If you ever want to know how much your property rights matter, wait until someone decides your land would be more useful to them. At 7:08 that Thursday morning, I woke to the electronic beep of a construction truck backing somewhere behind my house. Beep, beep, beep. Then came a sound I knew immediately, dry cedar dragging across gravel. I pulled on my boots, stepped through the back door, and stopped cold. Nearly 180 feet of my western fence was gone. Not leaning, not damaged by a storm. Gone. Cedar posts I had set with my own hands were stacked beside the driveway. Sections of fencing lay flat across the grass, and bright orange flags formed a line through the exact strip of ground the fence had protected for years. Beyond them, a compact grading machine sat idling beside an 8-foot-wide path of freshly disturbed soil. The morning smelled like diesel exhaust, damp grass, and raw cedar. 3 contractors in reflective vests stood near their truck, and right in the middle of them was Patricia Caldwell, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, holding a clipboard against her navy jacket like she was inspecting a project she had every right to approve. I walked toward her slowly. "Who authorized you to remove my fence?" Patricia turned without looking surprised. "The board did." I looked past her at the posts stacked on my property. "The board does not own this land." Her expression tightened just slightly. She opened the clipboard and showed me a printed site plan covered with colored lines. "According to our records, this is part of the community corridor. The bike trail extension was approved last month." I stared at her for a second, waiting for the punchline that never came. "You removed my private fence for a bike trail?" "Your fence was obstructing the planned connection," she said. Planned connection. I remember those 2 words because of how ordinary she made them sound. Like 12 years of ownership could disappear because somebody drew a green line across a map. I took out my phone and started recording. I captured the contractors, the equipment, the orange flags, every removed post, and the untouched brass private property plaque lying face up beside the cedar boards. Patricia noticed. "There is no reason to make this confrontational, Daniel. I am documenting what happened." One contractor lowered his eyes toward the ground. Another glanced at Patricia. That was when I noticed something else about 50 feet behind her, mounted high on a black pole at the Cedar Ridge Trail entrance. Their security camera was pointed almost directly toward us. I had seen it hundreds of times and never given it much thought. That morning, sunlight flashed across its dark housing while a tiny red status light blinked steadily beneath the lens. Patricia followed my eyes for half a second, then looked back at me. At the time, neither of us understood just how important that little red light was going to become. I had built that fence 12 years earlier, long before Patricia Caldwell ever had a reason to care where it stood. When I bought the property, it was 3.6 acres of uneven grass, mature hickory trees, and an old detached workshop that needed almost as much work as the house. I make my living as a residential contractor, so before I installed anything permanent, I hired a licensed surveyor to mark every boundary. I still remembered the fluorescent stakes fluttering in the summer heat and the sharp smell of fresh-cut cedar when I started setting the posts. I measured twice, kept every post comfortably inside my property line, and spent 3 weekends building the western section myself. 180 feet of cedar, galvanized fasteners, and enough concrete to make sure Tennessee rain would not shift anything. The fence was never decorative. It separated my workshop and backyard from the undeveloped acreage next door. Cedar Ridge came later. First came the streets, then rows of new houses, then landscaped entrances and community signs. Eventually, the Homeowners Association built a paved walking and bicycle trail through its common property. I had nothing against it. On summer evenings, I could sometimes hear bicycle bells beyond the trees while I worked in my shop. The trail simply ended before reaching my boundary, exactly where the subdivision property ended. That arrangement worked for years. My fence stayed where the surveyor had placed the line, and nobody questioned it. I even mounted a small brass plaque near the gate that read private property. It was not meant to intimidate anyone. I had clients occasionally delivering cabinets or lumber to the workshop, and I wanted visitors to know where the public neighborhood ended and my land began. I kept the original survey, closing documents, fence material invoices, and property records inside a gray binder in a cabinet above my workbench. Contractors develop habits like that. Receipts disappear when you need them most, so I learned years ago to keep records. I also had a security camera above the workshop door, mostly because expensive tools have a way of attracting attention. It covered the driveway, part of the backyard, and one end of the fence, but not the entire western boundary. Until that Thursday morning, none of those details had seemed important. They were simply pieces of ordinary life. A fence, a brass plaque, a survey tucked inside a binder, a camera I sometimes forgot was even there. Standing in the damp grass while Patricia's contractors stacked my cedar posts beside their truck, those ordinary details suddenly felt very different. I looked at the orange flags running toward my workshop, then back at Patricia's printed plan. The line on her paper was not following the edge of my property. It was crossing it, and I knew that because I had spent 12 years knowing exactly where my land ended. 3 weeks before I found my cedar posts stacked in the grass, Patricia Caldwell had stood at my kitchen counter with a glossy trail map spread between us. She had called first, which was unusual enough that I remembered the conversation clearly. Cedar Ridge wanted to complete its recreational loop before fall, she explained, and the shortest connection between two existing sections ran along the western edge of my property. On her map, a green line curved behind my workshop and continued toward the subdivision's south entrance. It looked harmless on paper. In reality, it would bring bicycles and pedestrians within roughly 40 feet of the building where I stored tools, materials, and customer projects. Patricia called it a recreational easement. I called it what it was, permission to use part of my land indefinitely. I appreciate you asking, I told her, but I am not granting an easement. Her smile stayed in place, but something behind it changed. The trail would benefit the entire neighborhood. I understand that. Your property value could benefit too. Maybe. My answer is still no. She folded the map carefully and left without arguing. 2 weeks later, an envelope from Cedar Ridge appeared in my mailbox. The letter said the board was reviewing what it described as a historical community access corridor along the western boundary of my parcel. That phrase bothered me because there had never been a community corridor there. Before Cedar Ridge existed, that side of my property had bordered open acreage. I went straight to the workshop, pulled down the gray binder, and scanned the recorded deed and original survey. That evening, I emailed both documents to Patricia and the HOA property manager. I highlighted the boundary line and wrote one sentence beneath it. Please identify any recorded easement granting Cedar Ridge access across my parcel. Patricia replied the next morning. The board will review the matter. Nothing else came for several days. No survey, no easement document, no attorney letter, no request for another meeting. I assumed the paperwork had settled the question. Standing beside the missing fence that Thursday morning, I realized I had mistaken silence for acceptance. Patricia still had her site plan open on the clipboard. I pointed toward the orange flags. I sent you my recorded survey, and the board reviewed the available information, she said. Then show me the easement. She glanced toward the contractor supervisor before answering. Daniel, this project has already been approved. That is not what I asked. The grading machine continued idling behind us, its engine producing a low mechanical hum. I could smell fresh soil where the crew had begun clearing beside the old fence line. Patricia closed the clipboard. The association believes this corridor falls within its authority. Believes. That word told me more than she intended. I took another photograph of the orange markers, then one of the brass private property plaque lying beside the removed cedar. Finally, I photographed her site plan from where I stood. She had received my survey. She had been asked for a recorded easement. And now my fence was gone anyway. Whatever happened next, this was no longer going to depend on whose memory sounded more convincing. The contractor supervisor finally shut down the grading machine, and the sudden silence made the whole scene feel even stranger. His name was Mike, according to the patch stitched above his shirt pocket, and unlike Patricia, he looked increasingly uncomfortable with what was happening. I asked him to show me the work order without taking it from his hands. He hesitated, glanced toward Patricia, then turned the page so I could read it. The instructions were simple. Remove existing fence. Prepare trail alignment. The client listed at the top was Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. I photographed the document from where I stood, including the project number and date. Patricia immediately stepped closer. That is internal contractor paperwork. It describes work being done on my property, I said. I am documenting it. I moved slowly along the disturbed area, recording everything without touching the equipment or interfering with the crew. The truck logo, the license plate, the stacked cedar sections, the empty post holes, the orange marking paint, the brass private property plaque, even the tire impressions in the damp grass. My years on construction sites had taught me that arguments disappear into memory, but job site conditions do not. At 7:26, I called the county non-emergency number and explained that a contractor hired by a neighboring homeowners association had removed approximately 180 feet of my fence during a disputed property project. I did not demand arrests. I did not accuse the crew of anything beyond what I could document. I asked who could help verify whether work should continue while the boundary was disputed. Patricia stood 10 feet away listening with her arms folded. "This is unnecessary," she said when I ended the call. "Then show me the recorded easement." She opened her clipboard again and tapped the colored site plan. "This is the approved corridor. That is a drawing. I am asking for the recorded document that gives Cedar Ridge the right to cross my parcel." Mike looked down at his work order. Patricia did not answer. About 40 minutes later, a county code and property services representative named Eric Lawson arrived in a white county vehicle. I showed him my identification, photographs of the fence before removal, the survey copy on my phone, and the location of the original boundary markers I knew about. Patricia presented the HOA site plan. Eric studied both without pretending he could settle a title question from the grass. He walked the marked route, photographed the disturbed ground, and asked Patricia for the easement reference number shown on the county record. She did not have one. Eric then told Mike that continuing work across a disputed boundary before ownership and access rights were verified could create additional problems for everyone involved. Mike nodded almost immediately and told his crew to stand down. Patricia's jaw tightened. "We have a schedule," she said. Eric answered calmly. "Then verify the property rights before you continue the schedule." The workers began securing their equipment. I looked toward the Cedar Ridge Trail entrance again. The black security camera was still pointed our way, its small red light blinking above the quiet construction site. Patricia seemed determined to make this about her map. I was beginning to understand that the map might be the weakest evidence on the property. By 9:30 that morning, the contractor trucks were gone, but the damage looked worse without them there. The open strip where my fence had stood made the backyard feel strangely exposed, and every few minutes I caught the smell of freshly disturbed earth drifting through the workshop door. I spent the next hour pulling documents from the gray binder and photographing every page that mattered. The original deed, the recorded plat, the survey from 12 years earlier, the invoice for the cedar, the permit paperwork. Then I called Mark Ellis, the licensed surveyor who had handled 2 boundary jobs for clients of mine over the years. He could not come that afternoon, but when I explained what had happened, he moved another appointment and arrived shortly after 8 the next morning. Mark was not interested in Patricia's interpretation or mine. He wanted monuments, measurements, and records. He located the original survey markers, checked the county plat, ran his equipment along the western boundary, and marked the verified line with fresh stakes. I watched from beside the workshop as the answer became visible one point at a time. The fence had not wandered onto Cedar Ridge property. The proposed trail had wandered onto mine, and not by 6 inches or some tiny landscaping mistake that reasonable people could argue over. Along portions of the proposed route, the orange construction markings extended several feet inside my parcel. Mark checked again before saying anything. Finally, he lowered his equipment and looked at me. "Your old fence line is consistent with the recorded boundary." I asked the question that mattered most. "Do you see any recorded recreational easement here?" "Not on the documents I reviewed." That afternoon, I contacted Rachel Bennett, a property attorney I had worked with once on a contractor access dispute. I sent her the deed, Mark's preliminary field notes, my photographs, Patricia's earlier email, and the image of the HOA work order. Rachel called me less than an hour later. "Do not move anything," she said. "Do not rebuild yet, and do not let this turn into a shouting contest. We document first." By Monday, Mark had completed a signed survey update, and Rachel sent formal notice to Cedar Ridge disputing any claimed right of access and requesting the legal basis for the trail alignment. The response came through the HOA property manager instead of Patricia. According to the email, Cedar Ridge had authorized a community improvement project, but the contractor might have misunderstood the intended alignment. I read that sentence twice. 3 days earlier, Patricia had stood in my yard telling me the board had authority over the corridor. Now the explanation was shifting toward contractor error. Rachel noticed it too. "Save that email," she told me. I already had. Still, I knew what the next argument would be. Patricia could say the contractor misunderstood her. The contractor could say he followed the markings. The board could claim nobody intended to cross my boundary. It could become a clean stack of documents on my side against a pile of explanations on theirs. I was standing at the workshop window thinking about exactly that when my eyes settled on the black pole at the Cedar Ridge Trail entrance. The camera was still there. The same dark lens. The same tiny red light. And suddenly I remembered where Patricia had been standing when the crew arrived. When I mentioned the Cedar Ridge camera to Rachel, she stopped me before I could finish explaining what I wanted to do. "Do not ask them for the video yourself," she said. "We preserve it first." That distinction mattered. If I sent Patricia a casual email asking to see the footage, I would be giving her advance notice without creating the kind of formal record Rachel wanted. By Monday afternoon, Cedar Ridge and its property manager had received a written preservation notice covering security footage, access records, work orders, project communications, and any electronic records connected to the trail extension. The contractor received one too. Then we waited. I hated that part. Every time I walked past the open section of my yard, I saw those empty post holes and remembered the confidence in Patricia's voice when she called my fence an obstruction. 4 days later, Rachel called. They preserved the recordings. Cedar Ridge used a centralized security system with synchronized timestamps. The camera I had noticed at the trail entrance was only one part of it. Another covered the maintenance gate used by contractors, and a third watched vehicle access near the clubhouse. The first relevant recording began at 6:41 that Thursday morning. I watched it in Rachel's office with Mark's certified survey lying on the table beside me. There was no dramatic soundtrack, no perfect close-up, and almost no useful audio. It did not need any. At 6:41, Patricia's vehicle entered the frame near the trail entrance. She got out carrying the same clipboard I had seen later that morning. At 6:52, the contractor truck arrived. At 6:56, Patricia and Mike walked together toward my fence. She stopped several times along the cedar line while he looked between her and the paperwork. At 7:01, Patricia extended her arm toward the first section of fence. The gesture was clear enough that I felt my stomach tighten. At 7:04, the crew began removing it. 4 minutes later, at 7:08, I appeared from the direction of my house. I leaned closer to the monitor. There it was, in one uninterrupted sequence. Patricia had not arrived after some contractor mistake. She had been there before the first section came down. She had walked the alignment with the supervisor. She had remained on site while the removal started. Rachel replayed the sequence once, then paused on the timestamp. "This does not tell us everything," she said, "but it tells us a lot." She was right. The footage did not prove what Patricia had said to Mike, and I was not going to pretend it did. But it destroyed the convenient idea that an unsupervised crew had simply wandered onto the wrong property while the HOA knew nothing about it. The timeline was objective. The camera had no opinion about me, Patricia, the bike trail, or who sounded more convincing in a meeting. It simply recorded who arrived, when they arrived, where they stood, and what happened next. As I watched that tiny timestamp advance across the screen, I remembered the red light blinking above Patricia's shoulder that morning. She had spent weeks treating my survey like an inconvenience. Now her own system had preserved the one thing she could not redraw with a green line on a site plan: time. The first camera proved Patricia had been there when the fence came down, but Rachel was more interested in what happened before Patricia ever reached my property. 2 days later, Cedar Ridge produced the remaining records covered by the preservation notice, and that was when the story stopped looking like a boundary misunderstanding. The maintenance gate camera showed Patricia arriving at 6:28 that morning. At 6:31, her electronic badge opened the secured gate used by HOA employees and approved contractors. The access log recorded her name, badge number, gate location, and exact time automatically. At 6:34, Mike's truck entered behind her. They parked near the maintenance building, and the camera showed Patricia handing him a packet of papers before both vehicles headed toward the trail entrance. Again, there was no useful audio, so Rachel refused to speculate about what they said. She did not need to. The work order metadata filled in another piece. It had been approved the previous afternoon under Cedar Ridge's project account. and the attached site plan showed the same green alignment I had seen on Patricia's clipboard. Then Rachel opened an email chain from 3 days before the removal. Thomas Reed, the HOA property manager, had written to Patricia and 2 board members asking a simple question: has Mercer granted the easement? Patricia's reply did not say yes. It said the project schedule should remain in place while the boundary issue was being reviewed. Another message from Thomas warned that the association should confirm access rights before fieldwork began. I sat quietly while Rachel arranged the documents across her conference table. My original survey had been sent weeks earlier. Thomas had questioned the easement 3 days before the job. Patricia's badge opened the contractor gate that morning. The second camera showed her meeting Mike. The first camera showed her walking the fence line with him. The work order instructed the crew to remove the fence and prepare the trail alignment. None of those facts depended on my memory. More importantly, none depended on a single camera. This is what matters, Rachel said, tapping the access log. Independent records are telling the same timeline. Mike's written statement arrived the following day. He confirmed that his crew had been hired by Cedar Ridge to follow the marked trail alignment and remove the existing fence identified in the work order. He did not claim ownership of the boundary decision. He said his crew relied on the project information provided by the client. That closed the gap Patricia's explanation had tried to create. I went back to my workshop that evening and stood beside the open stretch of yard. The cedar sections were still stacked where the crew had left them. I picked up the brass private property plaque, wiped a streak of dirt from its face, and set it on my workbench beside the gray binder. Across the property line, the Cedar Ridge camera continued blinking red in the fading light. Patricia had treated technology like part of the neighborhood infrastructure, something designed to watch entrances and protect association property. But cameras do not care who sits at the head of a board meeting. Badge systems do not soften timestamps. Work order software does not change its memory because an explanation changes later. By then, Rachel had enough to request an emergency meeting with the Cedar Ridge board. This time, Patricia would not be standing in my yard holding the only map in the conversation. She would be sitting in front of records created by her own association. The emergency board meeting started at 6:30 on Tuesday evening inside the Cedar Ridge clubhouse. And for the first time since this began, Patricia did not have a clipboard in her hands. She sat at the far end of the conference table with Thomas Reed beside her and 5 board members arranged along both sides. Rachel and I took 2 chairs near the opposite end. I brought the gray property binder, but I never opened it. Everything we needed was already organized in front of us. Rachel began with Mark Ellis's certified survey. She placed the county plat beside it and walked the board through the western boundary without adding drama. The old fence line matched my parcel. The proposed trail crossed onto my property. No recorded recreational easement appeared in the documents reviewed. Patricia leaned forward. The intention was always to improve community access. One board member, a gray-haired man named Robert Hayes, looked at her. That does not answer whether we had access rights. Patricia started explaining the planning map, but Rachel did not argue with her. She simply asked Thomas to display the preserved security footage. The clubhouse lights dimmed, and the wall monitor came alive. At 6:28, Patricia's vehicle appeared at the maintenance gate. At 6:31, her badge opened it. At 6:34, Mike's truck entered. Then came the second camera. At 6:41, Patricia arrived near the trail entrance. At 6:52, the contractor truck appeared. At 6:56, she walked the fence with Mike. At 7:01, she pointed toward the cedar line. At 7:04, the removal began. Nobody spoke while the timestamps advanced. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the ventilation system. Then Rachel placed the work order on the table. Remove existing fence. Prepare trail alignment. After that came the email Thomas had sent 3 days before the job asking whether I had granted the easement. Finally, Rachel showed Patricia's response, keeping the project schedule in place while the boundary issue remained under review. Patricia's face had gone still. I believe the corridor was within association authority, she said. Robert looked down at the certified survey. You had been told the easement was not confirmed. The project was already scheduled. A schedule does not create property rights, he said. That sentence changed the room. The discussion moved away from whether the bike trail was useful and toward the decision that had actually been made. Thomas confirmed that Cedar Ridge's insurer had been notified. The board voted to suspend further trail construction immediately, authorized the insurer and association council to address my property claim, and begin an internal review of Patricia's actions. Patricia was temporarily removed from presidential duties while that review proceeded. There was no applause. I did not want any. I looked at the frozen camera image on the monitor, Patricia standing beside my fence minutes before it disappeared, and felt something quieter than victory. For weeks, she had treated the boundary as if enough confidence could make it flexible. But the survey did not move. The timestamps did not move. The access log did not move. And now, neither could the story. The settlement took another 5 weeks, which was longer than I wanted and probably faster than Cedar Ridge expected. Rachel handled most of the conversations with the association's attorney and insurance representative while I went back to doing what I actually knew how to do, building things instead of arguing about them. The final agreement was simple where it mattered. Cedar Ridge acknowledged that it had no recorded recreational easement across my parcel. The disputed trail alignment was abandoned, and the association agreed to cover the reasonable cost of restoring the fence along the certified survey line, along with the survey and legal expenses included in the settlement. The board approved a revised trail plan that stayed entirely on association property. Patricia never returned to the president's chair. After the internal review, the board elected new leadership and adopted a requirement that future projects near private boundaries receive documented property verification before contractors were authorized to begin work. I did not celebrate Patricia losing the position. By then, I had learned that the satisfying part was not watching somebody fall. It was watching the facts stay standing. On a cool Saturday morning, I started rebuilding the western fence. Some of the cedar sections were still usable, including several posts the crew had removed carefully enough to save. I replaced the damaged boards, reset the line according to Mark's fresh stakes, and checked every measurement before fastening the final section. The smell of cedar returned to the yard. Only this time it meant restoration instead of removal. When I reached the gate, I opened the workshop and picked up the brass private property plaque from beside the gray binder. There was still a thin scratch across one corner from the morning it had been dropped in the grass. I could have replaced it for $20. I did not. I cleaned it, polished the face, and screwed it back into the cedar exactly where it had been. A few weeks later, Cedar Ridge completed its revised trail. Instead of crossing behind my workshop, the pavement curved through association common land and connected with the southern section farther east. It was not as direct as Patricia's route, but it worked. Families used it. Kids rode bicycles along it. People walked their dogs there in the evenings. Nobody needed my property to make that possible. One afternoon, I was sanding cabinet doors in the workshop when I heard the faint ring of a bicycle bell beyond the fence. I stepped outside and leaned against the cedar for a moment. The autumn air smelled like sawdust and dry leaves. Across the boundary, the black Cedar Ridge security camera still stood above the trail entrance. Its little red status light blinked steadily, just as it had that Thursday morning. I had never been against the trail. I had never been against the neighborhood. I had only refused to accept the idea that something became community property because somebody in authority wanted it badly enough. Patricia had a board title, a project schedule, a contractor, and a map with a green line drawn across my land. I had a survey, a boundary, and patience. In the end, the most important witness belonged to Cedar Ridge itself. They installed that camera to protect their community. Instead, it protected something their board had temporarily forgotten mattered just as much: the truth.